Given that I run a YouTube channel about teaching with technology, you may be surprised to know that I actually haven't always been pro-technology in education. In fact, I used to be a huge naysayer. So how did I go from being an anti-tech teacher who mostly just lectured in front of my students to a teacher who taught podcasting, ran the Girls Who Code Club, and had students make green screen videos in my humanities class? This is the 5th video in a 6-part series we've put together about engaging today's students by building the classrooms of tomorrow. In the series, we've covered a ton of ground, starting from why you want to make a change in the first place, all the way through learning specific strategies and techniques for implementing universal design for learning to help you actually make that change. Be sure to check those videos out if you haven't already. The links are in the video description. Now, there are really 2 core principles at the heart of everything we've discussed so far. The first is that universal design for learning, or UDL, helps us reach all learners by eliminating barriers and creating entry points in our lesson design. And the second is that implementing UDL requires us to teach with technology. One reason for that is that we live in a technology integrated world. If we want to create learning experiences that are relevant, authentic, and valuable for students who live in that world, then we need to make sure our classrooms are also technology integrated. Also, if we agree that we should be making lessons as accessible as possible, then we need to be using the most powerful tools at our disposal to be able to do so. There's one missing piece here though. What skills and knowledge do teachers need to actually effectively teach with technology and implement universal design for learning? To understand the skills and knowledge that teachers need to develop, we can turn to the TPACK model. TPACK is useful because it shows the interrelatedness between knowledge about what we teach, how we teach, and the tools we use to teach. The 3 categories of knowledge in TPACK are content knowledge, which refers to a teacher's knowledge about the subject they are teaching, for example, knowledge about history; pedagogical knowledge, which refers to a teacher's understanding of how to teach, for example, how to lesson plan; and technological knowledge, which refers to understanding how to use and work with technology, for example, how to use software like Google Slides. Having one kind of knowledge does not necessarily mean you have the other. You could know everything there is to know about math, for example, and still have no idea how to teach it. But when you have a deep understanding of math and you know how to teach it, that's pedagogical content knowledge. In other words, knowing how to best teach your specific subject area. Technological pedagogical knowledge means learning how technology can change the way we teach. For example, my knowledge about how to create this instructional video about TPACK that you can watch at your own pace. And technological content knowledge is knowledge of how technology changes the delivery of content. And it's also about how content changes what we teach. So for example, we used to teach cursive, but now because of the way technology changes content, it would be more appropriate to teach students how to touch type. Ultimately, TPACK is communicating that the most effective teaching happens when teachers are able to combine their subject matter expertise, their knowledge about how to teach effectively, and their understanding of how to best make use of powerful technology tools. So on the one hand, we have a framework for how to effectively make use of technology to design engaging and accessible lessons. And on the other, we have a model that shows us the skills and knowledge that go into effective teaching with technology. So we had an idea. What if we brought these 2 models together to create a TPACK UDL infusion? So we decided to make one to define the specific skills and knowledge teachers need to reduce barriers and create as many entry points as possible through effective teaching with technology. In other words, a model for what you need to learn to become a 21st century teacher. To help you understand why this model is helpful, let's look at how I applied the idea of revising my lessons based on barriers and entry points by building my TPACK skills and knowledge in order to transition from traditional sit and listen style teaching to student-centric 21st century teaching. Although the process of becoming a 21st century teacher was highly personal to me, it is also a process that we can systemize and scale once we have the roadmap. Now, when I first started teaching, pretty much every single week looked the same. Students read the textbook, students took notes from the textbook, and then students took a test. And nearly every one of my students bombed nearly every one of those tests. When I first started teaching, my students and I faced a lot of barriers that weren't necessarily about lesson design, at least not on the surface. But if you had spent more than 2 minutes in my classroom, there's one barrier that would have stood out in particular. I knew next to nothing about teaching. In fact, it's not even fair to call what I was doing teaching because I had no idea how to even handle a room full of students. So in terms of barriers to learning, we had a significant one. My classroom was not safe. To reduce the barrier of my unsafe classroom, I needed to create an entry point by minimizing threats and distractions. In order to do this, I had to develop my skills in the area of pedagogy on the TPACK framework, and I learned about positive behavior management and classroom systems. Now that I could actually teach sixth grade content like ancient civilizations, I soon realized that many students had significant difficulty understanding what they were reading in the textbook because it had so many vocabulary words that they didn't know. I needed to open up entry points in clarifying vocabulary and symbols, which required me to build skills in pedagogical content knowledge. One strategy I learned was how to pre-teach students vocabulary through word-picture association games. But of course, students still struggled reading the textbook, so I had to continue building my pedagogical content knowledge, and I started to learn how to create more entry points through guiding information processing and visualization by taking larger pieces of text and chunking it into smaller pieces to help students with comprehension. The notebook students were using to take notes from the textbook was also presenting a barrier because it wasn't really supporting them with comprehension. Students were often stuck staring at the blank boxes and had trouble getting started. So again, I had to continue to build my pedagogical content knowledge and learn strategies for how to create entry points in maximizing transfer and generalization by showing students how to use different types of graphic organizers as an alternative to the question and answer notebook that they were using before. So now my lessons started to look more like this. I pre-taught background knowledge before teaching students chunked parts of the textbook and then gave them some choices in graphic organizers they could use to help them process the information that they learned. And then they still took a test. Although I was getting better at creating more entry points, my students still weren't all that interested in learning about ancient civilizations. And I don't blame them. My class was super boring. The textbook that I used was pretty good in that it had some ideas for alternative assessments that you could do with students, things like making comics, even writing postcards home after taking a pretend trip up the Nile. But for a while, I was way too intimidated to try any of that. And when I say a while, I mean 3 years. Having seen how uninterested my students were in learning about ancient civilizations, which is supposed to be a fun subject, I decided that I would step outside of my comfort zone and try something new for the sake of engaging students by opening up more variety in the way students could express their knowledge, specifically by having them use multiple media for communication. At this point, that actually doesn't mean that I was teaching with technology. It just means that before a test and later in replacement of a test, I would look for ways for students to be able to represent what they had learned creatively. I started having students making maps and books, and we even started doing things like class debates where I would dress up like Zeus. Learning what I needed to know in order to make these creative projects happen required me to continue developing my pedagogical content knowledge. These creative demonstrations of learning also gave me some additional ways to recruit student interest. Now I could pitch the project that they were going to do in addition to the content. I really recognized the power in investing students in what they got to do with their knowledge, because some students that I would have to cajole into reading and writing would do it willingly if they knew they got to do something cool with that reading and writing. The projects did present another barrier though, because the jump from the graphic organizers to the project was a little bit too much. So I needed to create an entry point to maximize transfer and generalization of knowledge. In other words, supporting students to take information from their graphic organizers and using it to plan a draft of their projects. Learning how to help students transfer information from the graphic organizers to their project planners meant further deepening my pedagogical content skills and knowledge. So now my lesson sequences started to look more like this. Get students interested before we get started, then read the chunked textbook, use different graphic organizers to make sense of the text, transfer information from the graphic organizers into a project planner, and then they would produce a creative demonstration of learning. Now, the project planner was a good idea in theory, but in practice, students lost it. And when students were working in groups, the paper-based project planners that I was passing out weren't working at all call for collaboration. So for the first time, I turned to technology as a solution. At this point, the only students in my class who had access to the entry point of optimizing access to tools and assistive technologies were students who had personal computers as an accommodation through their individual education plan. So I drew upon the technological knowledge that I had at the time, which was pretty much limited to Google Docs, and turned the paper-based planner into a Google Doc planner. And now every student could use this digital project planner if they wanted, which helped them with collaboration and also pretty much did away with the issue of students losing papers. I did still have students who wanted to fill out their planners on paper, and that was totally fine. By applying my knowledge about Google Docs to my instruction, I was building my technological pedagogical knowledge. That is how technology can change our instruction. But it's not like suddenly after that, everything became about technology per se. For example, most students still didn't understand why learning about ancient civilizations was relevant for their lives. And I actually had to lean too much on investing them in the creative product and less in the content. And that's because I wasn't doing a good job with proactively helping students understand why it was relevant. So I had to deepen my content knowledge to move beyond just factual information about history to understanding why it was important for students to learn that information, and then ultimately engage students in the bigger why questions themselves. This came up with one of the projects that we did, which was a skit about ancient Egyptian social class. Before, I just had students do the skit about ancient Egyptian social class. But once I started to engage students in essential questions and larger themes, then we were also able to incorporate some connections to social class in our world today. I want to stick with a skit because actually that was one of the projects that I had the most difficulty getting students to do well. Some of them were pretty good, but some of them were also way off the mark and seemed kind of like a waste of time. Mostly through trial and error, I ended up discovering that the skits weren't all that good because they didn't actually know what the skits were supposed to look like. So here, I was able to use Universal Design for Learning to create an entry point in heightening the salience of goals and objectives. There's actually language here about how we need to engage learners in assessment discussions of what constitutes excellence. So I found some videos on YouTube of skits that other students had done and had my students evaluate them for what they thought worked and what didn't. And while they were watching those videos, a couple students were like, hey, why don't we make a video of our skit? I had never done anything remotely close to having students make their own videos in my class before, but the whole reason I was doing these projects was to engage students, and I felt like to have them make a video would definitely be the next level, and they were asking for it. And being able to deliver on a request that students had for a project was the ideal way for me to be able to continue to offer multiple ways of recruiting student interest. Getting to the point where I was able to do green screen projects with my students required me to build skills and knowledge in every area of our TPACK UDL infused model. For example, I developed my technological knowledge, teacher tech skills like organizing my digital files and knowing how to use programs so I could support students when they use technology. I developed my pedagogical skills, which we call running a blended classroom in this model, because I needed to learn how to teach in a blended classroom environment. Things like how to use a learning management system and how to manage a classroom when students are using computers. I grew in my content knowledge, not just knowing my subject area, but knowing how to make content relevant, learning how to use essential questions and thematic units to help students understand why what we were learning mattered to their lives. I built skills in pedagogical content knowledge, subject-specific strategies for optimizing my lessons for choice and accessibility through creating digital planning documents and helping students build background knowledge before reading. I incorporated technological content knowledge by teaching 21st century skills in applied technology skill building in creativity and collaboration. I developed skills in technological pedagogical knowledge and added to my toolkit of apps that helped me create universally designed lessons. And I grew in my understanding of how all these skills and knowledge intersect and make up technological pedagogical content knowledge. In other words, I was learning the bigger picture, a holistic sense of what it takes to become a 21st century teacher, and not to use technology for technology's sake, but for the explicit purpose of turning barriers into entry points, connecting me back to my core values about education, and helping deliver on the promise of educational equity while also helping better prepare students for their futures. If you want to learn how to take your lesson design from a traditional model to a 21st century model, then you should consider joining 21st Century Teacher. We're actually opening registration for 21st Century Teacher this Monday, February 28th, to 250 teachers. But if you want to make sure you secure your spot, there's still time to get your name on the early bird waitlist. Everyone on the waitlist is going to be sent a special registration link one day before the public on Sunday, February 27th at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. If you're hoping to join, you'll definitely want to get your name on the waitlist, which you can do by going to newedtechclassroom.com/21st century teacher. That link is also in the video description below. And this Sunday, February 27th at 9:30 a.m., I'll be presenting the 6th and final video in this series as a special live show. I'll be answering all of your questions and a lot more on that show, so I hope to see you there.